encased in what it required for it to work. So a feasibility study studies 6 different topics. So it studies the market to see if there is a market. It studies the competition to see if what competition exists and how we can deal with competition. There's also a financial analysis, of course, to see if it is actually cost effective. There's also a capacity utilization, which is the idea of what output OTC technology can give and what output it will have to give. So in that sense, it goes back into financial analysis because you need some demand if you want your product to be actually cost effective. We also looked at the products and services that OTC technology could provide. So mainly products, of course, because there's not really any services to be included. And we also did a site analysis to see where OTC technology could be installed. So there is a market, of course, so both for islands and for mainlands. So there, I'd like to make a quick reminder that there are the Paris agreements in place, of course. So there is a pressing demand for renewable energy sources. And so this is more important for islands because they have they have a small size and isolation, so they lack economies of scale in financing and power generation. So that's why there's a much bigger need for islands than for mainland. Yeah, there's several reasons why islands need renewable energy sources, but mainly it's because they need to transition from a diesel power generation to a renewable power generation. So yeah, there's a growing demand in energy worldwide right now. It's expected to grow by 55% by 2030. So given this, with the Paris agreements in place and the threat of climate change looming, there is a need worldwide to rapidly shift from fossil fuels to renewable energies, and the ocean provides many opportunities for this to happen. So especially for small islands because they're quite isolated, like I said, and so they can rely on different renewable energy sources, which the mainland can and islands cannot. All right, so we did direct competition, so which means we directly compared OTC technology to solar and wind, solar power and wind power. So the strength of OTC is that it's a large potential. It also uses the oceans, which means that its resource it's a continuous energy resource. There's almost no carbon footprint. There's no negative environmental impact, and yeah, like I said, continuous energy regeneration. In comparison, solar power is renewable, just like OTC and wind power, I guess, and it's easy to commercialize, and it uses the sun, which is an infinite resource, which goes back to renewable. Again, wind power, renewable, good commercialization, and using the sun, the wind, which is an infinite resource. So the biggest weaknesses of OTC is that the efficiency is very low. It's around like we'll go back to that, but it's nowadays it's around 1 to 3%, which is quite low, but it's compensated by the fact that you can pump enormous amounts of water from the ocean. It's also limited in space or limited in locations. So there's quite a few locations that it cannot be because of its need to have a temperature difference. On the other hand, solar panel, there is a low energy density. You need to install a lot of solar panels if you want to generate sufficient electricity. It also needs a wide space to be installed because of the low efficiency of solar panels, which is higher than 3%, which is like 20% for nowadays commercial solar panels, but it's still pretty low. And it needs a lot of it has a high cost at the beginning, which over 20 years is cost effective, but at the beginning it needs a high installation cost. On the other hand, wind power is limited in space because it needs strong wind. It also needs a high initial cost, and it needs to be wide space, so it needs to have space available as well. So the difference in OTC solar and wind power is that OTC has more opportunities because it is possible to create portable power during the process, which is a process called desalination. I'll come back to that as well. Um, there's additional production available, which means that you can create, technically speaking, you can create OTC power plants that generate a huge amount of electricity depending on the size. And there's a possibility to increase efficiency as well because it's around 1 to 3%, but the theoretical maximum efficiency is around 7%. So normally that can still be improved if funded. And then there's the need also for clean water as well, which is a worldwide problem nowadays. Solar panel as well. I mean, solar panels can float on the ocean. Are are also available on mainland in comparison to OTC. And there's also government active support and subsidies. And wind power is also floating on the ocean, I guess. So the threat to OTC, I'll come back to it as well, but it's mainly like the time and effort for conversation, which means that for now it's economically not viable for different reasons. Problem with solar panel is the problems of efficiency reduction due to external environments, and the problem with wind power is the wind is not blowing every day and it's not constant, so it's not continuous generation, just like solar panel in comparison to OTC. Okay. So what we did is we did a site analysis of the different places we could install OTC. So as you can see from this graph, the only places that are going to be viable for OTC technology are the Gulf of Mexico, the tropics, the Philippines, and the different part of the regions are all around the equator. So that's the problem of the location where you can install OTC. Plus, it has to be near an island. So if you add those two together, it means that OTC is quite limited in space. So if you use this ocean temperature gradient, the maximum temperature difference you can have is 20 degrees. I'll come back to what that means in terms of efficiency. So the idea was to use other sites to see if actually you could use a much more important temperature difference. So for hydrothermal vents, the temperature differs from every different hydrothermal vents. So it can go from 58 degrees to 460. It can go from like 60 degrees to like 464, 480 something. So you can have different temperature differences between like the ocean and hydrothermal vents of 58 degrees to 460 degrees, which is enormous. But the problem is that when you start going to too high of a temperature and too high of a depth, you start getting these volatile conditions where the water is like a supercritical liquid, which means it has both the properties of liquid and gases, which means it's very unstable. And so the problem is that OTC needs to pump a huge amount of water from the ocean. So I'm not sure that this source is viable because of the requirements for OTC technology, but it is a possibility. It still remains to be studied. Okay, so thermohaline circulation is a density-driven current where current plunges in the ocean due to its high density and then tries to find a location to go back to the surface. So it usually plunges around the Arctic areas, which means that the temperature is around -1 to 2 degrees Celsius for thermohaline circulation. So you can have potential water differences that range from 26 degrees to 29 degrees. The only problem is that it's very difficult to measure and to know where the current is located because it's a very, very slow current. It's quite impossible. It's kind of impossible to know exactly where it is. So it's a nice idea in theory, but the main problem is that you don't really know where the current is, even if you have a general idea. Okay, and then there's the idea of using Arctic areas where you can use the difference in temperature between air and water because air in winter in Arctic areas can range from 0 to -34 degrees in winter and from 10 to -10 degrees in summer, which gives a much bigger temperature difference than compared to if you use the temperature gradient of the sea itself. One of the only problems with this is that the problem of is the danger of climate change, where the planet is heating up. So I'm not sure. We're not sure if this technology will be viable in 30 years, because the idea is of making a OTC plant is implanting it and making it live for 30 years. But if climate change happens, and it probably will, then in 10 years or 20 years, the temperature differences will have decreased by quite a few. So it'll reduce the OTC efficiency by quite a lot. Okay, and then there's the idea of using waste heat from power plants. So again, this remains to be seen if it's possible. We do know that, however, that Russia has recently constructed a 70 megawatt nuclear power plant on a boat. So it'd be quite easy to just use to do a combined cycle and use OTC to have a temperature difference that would be over 30 degrees. So, but the problem is that really a case-to-case basis is needed, and there's also infrastructure difficulties because most power plants are not located on the mainland, are not located near sea. So, in that sense, power plants from islands could be easily be used normally, and doing a combined cycle with OTC remains a potential idea. Okay, so we also did a efficiency comparisons for the different energy sources. So but this is a theoretical efficiency. So for temperature gradient, it's a maximum of 7 degrees, but for hydrothermal vents, it could go up to 62 degrees. And then for thermohaline Arctic areas and waste heat from power plant, it remains around the same, even if it's higher for Arctic areas. So for now, I think using ocean temperature gradients as a site is good enough. And for now, what OTC technology needs to focus on is increasing its 1 to 3% efficiency that is already lower than the theoretical maximum efficiency. Okay, so the capacity utilization is the idea of the difference between what OTC plant can give and what the demand is. So we don't really have figures for that. So we use the coal steam generators and natural gas combined cycle generators, which normally fluctuate around like 50% to 60%. So this is something to keep in mind when constructing OTC plants. Okay, so we also did the financial analysis. So again, several studies have been made on this subject, but some of them contradict each other. But generally speaking, for 1 to 10 megawatt plants, the cost of electricity could range between 0.18 to 0.4 USD per kilowatt. And for 50 to 100 megawatts, the cost of electricity could range between 0.07 to 0.3 USD per kilowatts. So as you can see, for larger plants, the cost would decrease almost exponentially. So given that there's no big plant right now, we don't know if the costs will actually decrease, but theoretically speaking, it should go down. So we also looked at the LCOE, which is the sum of all capital costs and lifetime generations and maintenance costs, divided by the electricity generation to grid acclimated through the technology lifetime. So this is a nice figure which allows us to make like direct comparisons with other technologies. And as you can see again, the more the plant capacity augments, the lesser the cost will become. This again comes from a study which we're not entirely sure is the truth, but we can say it is reliable. Okay, double slide. So like we said, we talked about the different projects that could be available apart from generating electricity. So there's desalination, so the idea of producing fresh water out of the seawater, which is pretty easy because OTC pumps huge amounts of fresh water, of seawater. But also the air conditioning, again, easy because the seawater pump from the ocean there's an enormous amount of it, so it'd be quite easy to use that water. There's also the chilled soil agriculture. Again, the same principle of using the seawater that comes from the deep ocean to pass underground pipes into the mainland and to produce products that are not usually produced all year round. So Japan has already been doing that with their with a vegetable of theirs. I forgot the name. And then there's aquaculture, which I don't know if you know what aquaculture is, but it requires a huge amount of water that has nutrients. And since deep sea water has loads of nutrients, then just simply reusing the water that's passed through OTC cycle for agriculture could be a huge benefit because it would reduce the cost of aquaculture by a huge amount. And then there's the idea of hydrogen production because using a process called electrolysis, we can produce hydrogen. So by using OTC technology, you can produce large amounts of hydrogen because the electrolyte that is water is available again in huge amounts thanks to OTC technology. Okay, so conclusion, the short answer is yes. OTC is feasible. I mean, as you can see from this graph, there's quite a lot of different products you can make from it. So desalinated water for drinking irrigation. You can also make building air conditioning. You could also, like I said, do aquaculture, and then even then, on this graph, you can also do hydrogen production. And hydrogen production is an important resource. Yeah, so the main drawback for now remains the economic feasibility because, as you said, the efficiency is very low, and there's not been a lot of research concerning OTC. It's still in its infancy, despite having been developed in like the 1880s, because people have found it not to be viable, but actually it is, and recent studies has shown that. So this is, I put a quote, technically, environmentally, and economically, not considering OTC is a risk the world cannot afford to take, and that was taken from a study. So not my words. So just to show points. All right. So so we did define the feasibility requirements. Cancel. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So we did define the feasibility requirements to produce energy out of water temperature differences. That's done. And we did also inspect the different hot and cold sources. So now what we have to do is maybe make a more direct comparisons with wind and solar energy to compare prices in a more direct way. Maybe make a more elaborate way explanation as to why OTC technology should be privileged over wind or solar energy. And so now we still have to finish our secondary goal, which is combining a variety of ways to raise energy efficiency, which is also partially done because by doing the feasibility study, we also saw how we could raise energy efficiency by looking at different hot and cold sources. So we just did an updated schedule, and so yeah, that's our updated schedule. And this is still the same job allocation. And these are the references. All right, that's it.
All right. Question from Susan.